Hey guys, my name is Eric Peng and I'm the founder of Daily Fantasy Nerd. We're going to go over today how I go about creating my MLB DFS lineups and give you a general idea of breakdown of the important stats that you should be looking at and general basic and advanced MLB DFS strategy. So let's get started. We'll actually take a look at Monday, April 4th for our analysis here. And the first thing I'd like to show you is the game matchup section. This section will show you Vegas odds as well as weather. These are really important starting points, especially in baseball. So for the Vegas odds, we list here the win percentage of the team based off of Vegas. And this is useful when you're identifying pitchers to start. So you want to focus on pitchers that are going to have high win percentages because the win from a fantasy point scoring percentage standpoint has a heavy impact on overall fantasy point production. The other thing that you want to consider is that home teams that have high win percentages, for example, Arizona here, if you're batting, let's say, first through fourth in the lineup and you're hoping your guy gets 5 plate appearances, they may not get that in a low scoring game because their team's ahead. So that's something to be aware of when you're playing home hitters versus away hitters, especially when they're favored to win. Next, we have over-under. Over-under is the expected total runs scored between both teams. And so you want to focus on the offensive side on games with high over-unders. So for today, April 4th, that would be Minnesota-Baltimore here, Philly-Cincinnati. On the other side, we have the Dodgers and Padres who have the lowest scoring total expected for the day. And so you want to avoid this game for hitters generally. Now, there's always exceptions to the rule, especially when GPP. So for the most part, when I'm talking about cash games and not necessarily going against the grain. One other thing to consider for this is that while you want to favor high-scoring games for hitters, you want to favor low-scoring games for pitchers. So it's useful on both sides of the equation. Over here, we have temperature and wind, as well as rain. So weather is very important in baseball. For the first point, actually weather or rain is very important because you want to avoid games that could be rained out. If a game has a lot of rain, the umpires could decide to postpone the game, in which case your guys could score no fantasy points. In fact, I believe that if the game doesn't get past a certain number of innings, even if your guy hit a home run in the first inning, if the game's postponed, that game's stats just don't count. So especially in cash games, you want to avoid games that have a high risk of potential rainout. Generally, I'd consider that above 70% you want to avoid. Above like 50%, that's like kind of danger zone. I'd still avoid it for cash games. You might consider it for GPPs. And under like 30%, this 5% here is generally considered safe. And you can actually click in to see what the rain percentage is throughout the game from 1 hour before first pitch to 4 hours after. So this is a way to see, like, maybe it's a high precipitation chance at the start, but then it's going to clear up. So they might just have a rain delay for an hour. And then there's a good chance that the game actually plays through. So this is a way of you figuring that out. Over here, temperature is very important in baseball because the hotter the temperature is, the further the ball is going to travel because air density decreases at higher temperatures, which means less air resistance, which essentially means that the ball travels further. Humidity has a similar impact, and wind is very important as well in certain stadiums. Not all stadiums, but certain stadiums will be very conducive to high winds, causing balls to get hit out further. This is especially true when winds are exceeding about 10 miles per hour and very true at above 15 miles per hour. And we actually did a breakdown of historical analysis across individual stadiums to see which stadiums are impacted most by wind. The notorious example of this is Wrigley Field, where when the wind's blowing out towards center, higher than like 10, 15 miles per hour, the number of home runs being hit increases drastically. Also, when you're talking about temperature, as a whole, for every 10-degree increase in temperature usually results in about a 6% increase in home runs being hit. So these are very important things to keep an eye on for baseball, and we live update this weather regularly throughout the day. We pull it from forecast.io, And so this is very important to keep an eye on in DFS. One other thing is that we orient the wind direction based off of the orientation of the ballpark. So that's something that we do for you as well. Okay, so that gives us a summary of the Vegas odds and weather. Next, we'll take a look at the players table and give you a general idea of what you should look for amongst hitters and pitchers. So we'll start off with the hitters. Over here we have the Vegas projected runs scored. So this is calculated taking the over-under and the win percentage, the money line. And you can actually sort by the runs scored to see who's going to be the top hitting teams of the day. And this is a good way of figuring out what teams are useful to stack on any given day. And we'll talk about stacking in a little bit. So Cincinnati at 4.65 runs, Arizona at 4.48, Baltimore. Those are probably the top three hitting teams to potentially stack if you're looking at doing that in GPPs. And you can see that those are aligned with the high scoring games of the day. So we'll go back to sorting by fantasy points. We list the opposing pitcher here. You can actually click in to see their game log, as well as for your hitters. The wOBA here this is weighted on base average. In fact, we can click into the legend here and see weighted on base average. This is actually a split against the pitcher's handedness. So we break down these stats for both wOBA and ISO based off of whether the hitter's facing a lefty pitcher or righty pitcher, because their splits are oftentimes going to be different. And that's one way of getting a lot of value on any daily slate. So wOBA is a measure of a hitter's overall offensive value. It's a better stat than just batting average because it accounts for a double or triple or home run being more valuable than a single. Whereas batting average does not do that. It just takes hits over plate appearances. So wOBA's a useful stat as kind of a catch-all offensive stat, as well as being very useful in cash games. ISO, on the other hand, stands for isolated power. And this is also a split based off of the pitcher's handedness. This is a measure of the hitter's raw power and likelihood to hit for extra bases. So this is actually a more useful heuristic for measuring the hitter's likelihood of hitting a home run than historical home run numbers. And it's a useful stat for GPPs because you're looking for upside. So if we go back here, we can see here that under the pitchers column, this is the pitcher wOBA against right-handed hitters. So we'll break down the pitcher wOBA based off of the hitters split, and we'll take the hitter wOBA based off of the pitcher's handedness. And so we have these wOBAs listed here. So for example, Jake Arrieta has a very strong wOBA, which makes Mike Trout less of a intriguing play for today. And this diff here is the percent difference from this wOBA and the league average. So essentially you want to look for opposing pitcher matchups that have wOBAs worse than the league average. And so we'll show you that percent difference here. So Jake Arrieta's wOBA is a lot better than league average, so it's actually a negative percent impact on Mike Trout. And so over here on the hitter side, we have the wOBA for the hitter against the pitcher, and we'll take the percent difference here of this wOBA versus Goldschmidt's overall average wOBA, because oftentimes the way that DFS hitters are priced is based off of kind of their overall statistics. And so you're always looking for value based off of what is different about today's slate versus their overall average. And for hitters, that's based off of this handedness split and some other factors that we'll talk about soon. So you can see here that oftentimes, in fact, the vast majority of cases, hitters have favorable splits against the opposing handedness. So righties hit better against lefties than against righties, and lefties hit a lot better against righties usually than against lefties. So you can see that pretty much all of the top positive splits here are opposing left-right or right-left. And for example, Trout here, this is not a positive split for him. Korea here has a negative split as well. So that's something to keep an eye on. And it's usually more true on the power side. So for example, well, we'll see more examples when we kind of go a little bit further in this. So ISO, you can see here that this is the measure of hitter's power. Donaldson has a lot more power against lefties than against righties, and so he has a very positive percent split here. Next we have the batting order. So normally this would show you the last 7-day batting average in gray, but since it's the start of the season, we don't have any data yet, so we don't have this populated. And as starting lineups come in, we're actually going to highlight the team green here, and it'll list their actual starting batting order spot in bold green here instead of gray. And so batting order is very useful because when guys move up, especially in the batting order, that's one way of getting a lot more value for a player. So for example, guys that get leadoff will normally get average nearly 5 plate appearances a game, whereas a hitter that's batting ninth may only get about 4 plate appearances a game. So that's like a 25% difference in potential fantasy point production based off of plate appearances. And when you furthermore add in that a guy that's batting first or second has a lot higher chance of scoring runs because the guys behind them in the batting order have a lot more power and are better hitters. Usually, they have not only a better chance of getting more plate appearances, but they also have a better chance of scoring runs. Likewise, guys that are batting third or fourth have the best chance in the lineup of knocking in runs because the first and second hitters are usually the best guys at getting on base. So batting order is huge, and you especially want to keep an eye on guys that may be moving around in the batting order. That's why we have this batting order difference here. We take if the starting lineup is announced, then we'll take the difference between their today's batting order versus their 7-day average, and you can actually sort by this column to see who has moved up most or who has dropped the most in the batting order. And so all of that is, in fact, all of these stats that we've been talking about will and are incorporated into our overall projections here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Next, we have park factors. So park factors is the percent difference in impact on the hitters based off of the ballpark that they're playing at. So the classic example of this is Coors Field, where it's just a very favorable ballpark to hit at, and they'll usually get a positive park factor split here. On the other side, there are certain ballparks that are pretty poor to play at, and so they'll usually get negative impact. One thing to keep in mind is that these park factors are adjusted by handedness. So certain ballparks might have a shorter left field porch, or maybe center field's going to be a lot further, or right field's going to be a lot further. So this is accounting for handedness as well. The other thing to consider is that certain teams may normally play at poor ballparks, so their overall season average is going to be skewed worse than a normal player. And so if that player goes to play at a normal ballpark, they might actually show that they'll have a positive park factor here, just because we're again looking for differences between how a player is normally priced, which is based off of their aggregate season average usually, compared to where they're playing today. Next, we have temperature factor. Temperature factor is what we talked about earlier around the weather and higher temperatures being more favorable conditions to play in, and cold temperatures being less favorable to hit in. So here you can see, for example, if we sort by temperature factor, Arizona's hot, 89 degrees, so it's pretty favorable. We also have Texas. Where's Texas? Texas, 82 degrees. Whereas if we take the negative side, we have Cleveland, Boston, 34 degrees, very cold. So we got all of these numbers based off of historical backtesting that we've done to figure out how increases or decreases in temperature affect certain hitting categories, and we actually adjust those individual hitting categories accordingly. Finally, we have wind factor. So as we discussed, wind has a considerable impact on home runs being hit and even on hits and runs scored. So if we take a look at Boston and Cleveland, not only is it cold, but the wind is blowing in at 15 miles per hour. And so if we click in here, you can see that that's pretty consistent. The rain chance goes down, so that's not too big of a concern here. But that's not a favorable condition for players in this game. If you look here, there's not too many situations where the wind's blowing out too much. And even if it is, for example, game players in this game, there's still no wind factor adjusted because we've done some historical analysis on the Yankees stadium and how wind propagates there, and so we are not adjusting that today. Okay, so that's the factors. Over here we have the fantasy point average. So this is season average. This will get populated as we have a few games under our belt. This is last 80 games fantasy point average. So we go into last season. This is something that we show in the beginning of the season so that you have some type of benchmark to work off of. Over here we have floor. So this is usually this is a season fantasy point average minus 1 standard deviation, but currently we're using last 80 because of the start of the season. And ceiling is plus 1 standard deviation. So the way that this is useful is that assuming a normal distribution, you'd expect a player to exceed their floor about 84-85% of the time, and you expect them to exceed their ceiling about 15-16% of the time. So floor is a useful stat for cash games, and ceiling is a useful stat for GPPs because you want to look for upside in GPPs and you want to look for consistency in cash games. Over here we have our projections. So this is Daily Fantasy Nerds proprietary projections. We live update this throughout the day. Incorporates all of the stats that we've been discussing, Vegas odds, weather, park factors, temperature, wind, all the splits, the expected runs scored here. So we aggregate all of this information for you into one number here for the projected fantasy points so that you can get a really easy, concise view of how we project a player is going to do on any given day. I highly recommend that you regularly check in throughout the day, especially right before lineup lock, because this fantasy point number is going to be changing pretty regularly, especially in the hour or so before lineup lock as starting lineups are adjusted. This will actually adjust for lineup position as well. So if someone moves up in the batting order, their plate appearances are going to be adjusted based off of where they're hitting, as well as we actually adjust by the run and RBI production based off of each lineup spot as well, because guys that are hitting first through third are typically going to be have a much higher likelihood of scoring runs and knocking in players than guys that are batting like 7th or 8th. So all of that is incorporated in here. And then finally we have the value. This is essentially the bang for buck, or the how much fantasy points are you getting per like $1,000 that are being spent here. So this is a good way of taking a look at who's giving you the most value. So for example here, Donaldson's going to give you more bang for buck than Goldschmidt here today, according to our projections. In all of this, I haven't mentioned that bright orange here indicates a very favorable stat. For example, this run scored here is very favorable, whereas dark blue is unfavorable. So that indicates not helpful for the hitter. Okay, so that gives us a good idea of the hitters. Let's take a look at the pitchers now. So if we scroll down here, We have over here we have the win percentage. This is the Vegas projected win percentage. It's the same number as over here, but listed per pitcher. So this is a useful stat to sort by when you're trying to figure out who has the highest chance of winning and likewise losing. Over here we have projected runs against. So I like sorting by this to see which pitchers are probably going to have the lowest scoring runs allowed. So one thing that's useful here is not only looking at who's going to allow the least runs, but who's going to allow the most runs, because you may want to consider stacking guys who are playing on the Reds hitters, because this pitcher is expected to give up a lot of runs. Over here we have the Vegas projected strikeout total. This will be populated the day of, usually an hour or so before the game, and this will show how many strikeouts Vegas projects this pitcher to get on any given day. So you can actually sort by this once these numbers populate. And I'll go back to Sunday's games to give you an example of that in a sec. Next we have opposing offense average runs scored. So this currently is based off of 2015, and we'll update this for 2016 once we have a larger sample size. But it's a good way of getting an idea of, is the pitcher pitching against an offense that for the season has done well or pretty poorly. Next we have opposing starting lineup average wOBA. So once the starting lineups are confirmed, we'll take those players in the starting lineup and average all their wOBA so that you can see whether it's a strong offense or a weaker offense, because based off of the splits, based off of if there's a player injured or not, this run scored may not be the most accurate representation, whereas wOBA could give you a better idea of, for that day, how does that offensive lineup look like. Same goes for strikeout percentage. This will average the strikeout rate of that starting lineup for that day. And you can sort by each of these columns as well. Sometimes these can be useful for figuring out which teams to stack if you want to sort by the highest wOBA stack on offense. Over here we have the pitcher strikeout rate. So if you sort by this, you'll figure out which pitchers have the highest likelihood of racking up strikeouts, and similarly who has the lowest chance of striking out hitters. So strikeouts are, I would say, the king stat to look at for pitchers, because it really creates the situation where you have a higher floor as well as higher upside. In fact, if you sort by pitcher floor here, you'll find that guys that show up at the top here have high strikeout rates, whereas guys that show up at the bottom typically have much lower strikeout rates. And so there's a pretty direct correlation there, and just as true for ceiling here. So usually, especially for cash games or even GPPs, you want to try to focus on the guys that are going to have a high likelihood of striking out players. Over here we have Sierra. This is Skill Interactive ERA, which measures a pitcher's underlying skill level. So this will remove impact around park factors, whereas XFIP will actually include that as well as independent of their defense. So generally these will give you a good idea of a little bit more accurate stat than ERA in terms of how good a player is at preventing runs. I would say it's analogous to wOBA versus batting average in terms of it being a more useful stat. The unit is the same as ERA, so what would be a good ERA would also be a good Sierra. Over here we have the pitcher's handedness and how they do wOBA against lefties versus righties. And so this is the same stat as what we break down for you in the splits over here in the pitcher section. And then we will adjust the pitchers for park factors, temperature factors, and wind factors as well. So what would be positive here would be negative for a hitter, and vice versa on the hitter side. All right, so that gives you a general idea of the pitching categories. These are very similar here. One thing I would like to call out is that pitchers, for the most part, are going to be more consistent than hitters. You'll see that on a per dollar basis, their values are typically going to be higher than hitter values. And that's because they have a lot less variance. Their floors are higher. Hitters generally get 4 or 5 plate appearances per game, and they'll get hits like 30-40% of the time, or get on base that amount. And so you're going to get a lot of volatility on the hitter side of the equation. Whereas pitchers, you're going to get a lot more batter's face. And so you get to conquer that volatility a lot more on an average basis. And so what that means is strategically, you want to focus on paying up for pitchers in cash games because they're going to have higher floors than hitters will. Conversely, you may want to pay up for hitters in GPPs because they're more volatile and they have more upside. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about balancing your salary distribution between hitters and pitchers. Okay, next let's go through some hitters and take a look at who are potentially some good plays for today. So we'll start off by taking a look at some of these top dogs. So you want to focus on high run scoring games with a favorable splits across the board. So Goldschmidt looks pretty good. He has a lot of upside. Bryce Harper looks good. Donaldson looks very good. He has extremely favorable splits here. The only downside is the park factor is slightly negative, but he overall looks like a very strong play. I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the higher owned players for today. So one thing that we can do here is sort by overall wOBA for the day. You can see here who have the highest wOBA and generally get an idea of potential top plays. You can also sort by ISO, so these will be the top power hitters for the day. For some of these players, like Jarrett Parker, he has a small sample size, so that's something to consider, and so he'll be priced lower accordingly. In fact, for these percent differences here, we actually regress them towards the league average if they haven't hit a certain sample size target that we found is reasonable. So that's all something that we've built into these percent differences as well into the projections here. So if we look at these kind of value by sorting by wOBA and ISO, we can look at who are good values. So Adam Duvall could be a good value play. Typically for hitters, I'm going to avoid locking in players until these starting lineups are announced, just because you want to get that confirmation. And usually starting lineups are announced about an hour before a game is going to start. So you'll have more time than other sports to be able to know what's going on. And so these will get updated as they're announced throughout the day. And these projections will be updated accordingly as they come in. So another thing I like to do is sort by value here. This will be more appropriate once the batting order is announced, but these are going to be your top value plays. And so you can take a look at who's kind of the cheap values that you can fill your lineup with. All right, and on the pitcher side, usually the stats I really like to look at are win percentage, runs against, and K percentage. And so today I would say Kershaw looks really good. He's always going to be a very high floor, high ceiling play. And especially for cash games, I would say whenever he's playing, it's almost always a lock unless he's playing like one of the best offensive teams in the league. And even then, you may want to consider rostering him in cash games. So Kershaw looks really good. Scherzer looks really good, both because he has a good strikeout rate, high win percentage, good runs against, and he's playing against a weak Atlanta defense. Now, this is representative of last year, so that's something that'll get updated as the season progresses, but he looks pretty good. And some of these other high strikeout rate players look good. Arrieta, Greinke. So you can kind of take a look at these once the strikeout props as well as the opposing starting lineups come in, and that'll give you a little bit more accurate assessment of these pitchers. Next, I want to go over the batting lineup, or lineup filters here. So we offer the ability for you to specify the number of hitters to stack in your lineup. So for DraftKings, that's 5 hitters. For FanDuel, that's 4 hitters. And for Yahoo, I believe that's 6 hitters. And so this is a good way of specifying if you want to stack. You can basically say, I want to stack 5 hitters. Or for cash games, sometimes you may not want to stack because there's too high correlation, which means that you're going to get a lot more volatile results. So you can say, I want to stack 3 hitters. And so I'll start off with no filter set there just to give you an example of how this works. Okay, so this isn't necessarily the lineup I'm going to go with just because the starting lineup information is not in yet. But you can see here that Toronto has the most hitters currently. So let's say I change this stack to 5. Let's see what happens here. So you'll see now that Toronto has 5 hitters that are included in this starting lineup. And so this creates a lot more of a GPP lineup as a result. Likewise, you remember the original lineup had 3 stacks, so we could change this to a 2 stack if we don't want cash games to be affected. So now you only have 2 Toronto players here. Next, we also have batting order. So there's a lot of evidence that shows the top 5 lineup positions produce far more fantasy points than 6 through 9. So one thing that you might want to consider in cash games is to specify a max of 5, maybe 6, if you want to look for a little bit more value if the pitchers are expensive that day. And that can increase your floor and upside for that day. Right now there's no batting lineup information in, so this won't really do anything. But once it's in, that's something that you can play around with. Another lineup filter that we have is no hitters versus pitchers. When you select this option, it will prevent the optimizer from putting in hitters that are playing against your pitchers. So if for example, you have Kershaw in here, it's not going to put any San Diego hitters into the starting lineups. And you generally want to avoid that, especially in GPPs, but even in cash games, because let's say one of your hitters hits a home run, well, you don't get the full benefit of that because your pitcher's going to get docked accordingly. And so that's something to be aware of when you're creating your lineups. So I'm going to come back and probably play around with this later in the day as the starting lineups come in. And that's when I'm going to finalize my lineup. But I hope this was a useful exercise for you to get a general idea of Vegas odds, weather, hitter stats, and pitcher stats, for you to get a general sense of what you should be looking for when you're going about playing MLB DFS. There's a lot more for you to learn, but I hope this was a good starting point for you to get a general sense of how to use Daily Fantasy Nerd when you're creating your MLB lineups. So if you haven't had a chance, you can sign up for free by going to dailyfantasynerd.com and clicking Get Started Free. Thanks and good luck.